In this final unit of IT Security 1, we discuss implementation and maintenance of IT security systems. So I talked about a lot of the technologies and things that we use to assist us with IT security, but how do we implement changes and new technologies and things like that? And as you know, most people think that change is a good thing. We have to adapt over time. New technologies come out and so forth and so on. So change is definitely good, but sometimes the attitude is, but you go first, right? So in this unit, we're going to talk about implementing changes to IT security infrastructure and to policies and procedures and so forth. So usually we make changes to policy and procedures. We have to make changes with people, usually through training. We make changes to hardware through things like firewalls, the rules that support those policies that we might change. And by the way, one important thing I want to mention here is that we don't typically change firewall rules reactively to an attack. We should always look at it from a policy perspective of should we make this change and how are we going to make this change, and then we make that change. Of course, unless it's an emergency, I suppose. Software, change to software, usually through something like encryption. Change to data, maybe through classification. So organization translates a blueprint for information security into some kind of a project plan to initiate a project for some sort of change that's initiated from something like IT security. So a project plan must address the project leadership, the managerial, technical, and budgetary considerations, and it has to address organizational resistance to change. Many organizations have sort of this built-in resistance to change that sometimes we have to overcome. And there are legitimate reasons that organizations can be resistant to change. Sometimes change can be painful, sometimes it's expensive. So again, we have to make sure we're aware of that culture and how that works in the organization within which we're working. So the major steps in executing a project plan are: number one, we plan the project, supervise the tasks and action steps, we wrap it up. Those are the basic steps. If you've taken a class like Systems Analysis and Design, you've probably taught in a class like that about the software development lifecycle, which involves planning, analysis, design, implementation, and maintenance. And you could take some variation of the SDLC, which is common in just about all areas of IT. We could take some variation of that and apply it to an information security project. But every organization you work for will have its own norms for project management, its own methodologies for how it manages projects, and of course we have to acquiesce to some of those norms. So if we're going to develop a project plan, one of the important steps, if you've taken a project management class, and if you haven't, I highly recommend taking one. There's a lot of value to those courses. But one of the things that you'll learn about is something called a work breakdown structure, which basically is where you list all of the work or all of the tasks that have to be accomplished. You brainstorm and you define all of the tasks that have to be done in order to complete the project. You make sure you have somebody assigned to each one of those tasks. You create start and end dates, usually using something like a Gantt chart and a network diagram. I don't mean like a computer network diagram. There's a project management concept called network diagramming, where you diagram how these tasks fit together. And then you estimate the capital and non-capital expenses in order to complete the project, and dependencies between and among tasks. In other words, sometimes you have certain tasks that have to get finished before other tasks can commence. Sometimes you have tasks that simply take a set amount of time to complete. No matter what you do, they're going to take a certain amount of time. For example, shipping equipment always takes a certain amount of time. There's not much you can do about that other than expedited shipping, but even that has a finite amount of time assigned to it. You can't really speed that up. So some things just take time, and you have to be aware of that, and you have to plan for that. So every major work breakdown structure task is further divided into smaller tasks and specific action steps, so you can estimate the time and effort involved to complete those tasks. So here is an example of a work breakdown structure. There's one thing that we don't talk about in this course that you would learn about in a project management course that's important for things like this, which is being able to budget time. So not only the amount or the cost, but the work, the amount of work required to complete the task as a function of time. And one of the methods to do that is something called PERT analysis, which is a method for trying to accurately estimate the completion time for different tasks. So again, project management classes would give you some background in that, and I would highly recommend taking a project management class if you haven't. And that's, of course, useful for all projects, not IT security. Well, IT security, we're talking about in this course, but just about any project would involve those. So project planning considerations. As project plan is developed, adding detail is not always straightforward. Some special considerations including financial, priority, time, schedule, staff, procurement, feasibility, training, indoctrination, and scope, they all have to be considered when you're planning a project. So some of the financial considerations. Regardless of the existing information security needs, the amount of effort that can be expended depends on available funds. If you don't have the money, you can't do it. That's just business. So we got to make sure we have the money and that we can fit this project into the available budget. Cost-benefit analysis is one way that you can present a project to upper management. So one of the things that I typically will recommend to folks that I'm working with when we're talking about any kind of investment in infrastructure, if you can present that investment with cost-benefit analysis in the financial language that the C-suite understands, there's a much better chance that it'll get approved, because a lot of times we have to justify these expenses. Too often I work with people in IT security and they say, we really want to do things the right way, but we can't because we just don't have the budget. Management just doesn't make it a priority for us. And when I ask them what you've done to try to make it a priority, they say, well, we explain to them technically why it's necessary. But that's not always enough. You have to put it into financial terms. Most businesses are looking at financial numbers. People in the C-suite are looking at how much money are we going to lose, how much money we're going to make. And if you're presenting something that they just simply see as an expense with no realization of that investment, they're not going to be very interested in talking to you about making that investment. But if you can put it in terms of how much money you're going to save, or how you're going to protect yourselves from from some kind of harm that could cost money, that's definitely a better strategy for getting things approved. You have to present it as a business case. And again, in a project management class, you would learn how to do that. You would learn how to do a cost-benefit analysis, how to use the time value of money to figure out the net present value and the return on investment. All of those skill sets that they're looking for in the executive suite. That would certainly, as an IT security person, that's kind of sets you apart from the rank and file IT security, being able to talk that language and being able to understand that. So again, I highly recommend understanding that stuff and looking into how to do that. And 2 courses you could take is project management. Another one is systems analysis and design that would help you with that. So both public and private organizations have budgetary constraints, though of a different nature. Public organizations are usually accountable to a shareholder or to the government, where private organizations, you're accountable to whoever owns the company, or if it's a nonprofit, to their mission. So to justify an amount budgeted for a security project, in any of these cases, it's useful to benchmark expenses of similar organizations and look at what they're doing. So benchmarking, sort of like baselining, looking at what other organizations do. So priority considerations. In general, the most important information security controls should be scheduled first. So try to prioritize the things that are most important to secure the infrastructure, and then you can work on the things that are less important. So that goes without saying almost. Time and scheduling considerations. So time impacts the project plans. So you want to look at which projects are going to take the longest and give you the best return on your effort. You're looking at staffing considerations. In some cases, you may not have the people to complete the project, or you have people available for certain projects because maybe they're done on other projects. You have to look at where you're going to put your people in order to complete these projects. And to be fair, sometimes the people are the most expensive part of a lot of these projects. Buying something from a vendor might be expensive, but to pay the people to manage it, configure it, set it up, and design it, sometimes that costs us even more in time and effort. So it's important to keep in mind the staffing considerations. And then you have procurement considerations, which is where are we going to get this? Who's the vendor that we're going to buy it from? In some organizations, you have to be cognizant of the rules and how you purchase, how you issue RFPs or requests for proposals to vendors. There's a lot of rules that are set up in doing this for most organizations that you have to be aware of. So you certainly want to run afoul of those rules. And sometimes you have rules on which vendors you can use. They have to be vetted, or they might have to be from approved lists. So it's important to make sure you're aware of all that stuff before you consider where you're going to acquire this stuff. We have organizational feasibility requirements. So changes should be transparent to users unless it's intended to change some procedure or it's going to be some kind of change to the business. So we have to look at the impact to the organization and how it's going to affect our users. Successful projects require that the organization be able to assimilate proposed changes. So we have to make sure that the people who use the technology are going to be willing to make this change. There's no shortage in IT of projects that failed because the organization did not accept the change. They simply refused to do that. I've probably mentioned before that I work a lot in healthcare. And in healthcare, if we initiate a change and the doctors that use the systems are not in favor of the change or they're not on board with the change, there's very little chance that it's going to be successful. We can try as hard as we can, but if those users do not adopt the new system without complaining too much, then it's very difficult to implement it because they're the boss. They're the ones that we're trying to keep happy. And all organizations have something like that. We also have training and indoctrination considerations. So this could be affected by the size of the organization, but basically how you're going to get all of these people to use this new process, procedure, or whatnot. Again, if this is a transparent change, hopefully we don't have to train users, but sometimes there are big changes that require users. For example, I work with a client that recently changed their authentication system. In the old days, if you wanted to access a server, you simply remoted into it. But they wanted something more secure, so they implemented a change where if you want to access a server, you have to request access through a system where you go to a web page and you elevate your permissions for that particular server, and then you're able to access the server for a certain number of hours, and then it automatically pulls back your permissions to access that server. So it's all controlled through a sort of a web portal. And when they implemented that system, a lot of IT people complained about it. This is a very large organization with a lot of IT people, and they complained about the complexity of getting access to servers. They'd say, well, what if it's in the middle of the night? I have to remote into this other system first and wait for it to apply my permissions. And there was a considerable pushback on that. So those would be indoctrination considerations and making sure that everyone's trained and knows how to use the new system before it goes live. Otherwise, you're going to have even more problems. And then there are scope considerations. So there's this thing in project management they talk about called scope creep, which is when you have a project that has a limited scope and things keep getting bolted on to that original scope to the point where the project is almost unrecognizable and it becomes a much larger project, but the budget doesn't change and the time constraints don't change. And that's certainly a problem. So you have to clearly define the scope of what it is you're doing before you embark on a project to make sure it's going to be successful. So project management, I've mentioned it a bunch of times, but project management is a unique set of skills. It takes a special skill set to be a project manager. You have to be very organized. You have to know how to manage people and manage time and be able to estimate those things. You have to be able to coordinate meetings and things like that. You can take a certification to be a project manager, PMP. It's a highly sought after certification. A lot of larger organizations insist on having PMPs on staff to manage projects. It's not rocket science. It just takes a lot of persistence and a lot of organization. Having organizational skills to keep everything straight, and persistence to make sure that things are getting done, and to keep after people, to keep attending these meetings and things like that. So most information security projects require a project manager or some kind of skilled IT manager. And again, it could be a dedicated PMP in many organizations is what I find that manage these projects. Typically, we have a supervised implementation, which means that our project manager is supervising the project. They're not doing the work. So a project manager isn't somebody who can sit down and do the work. They're somebody who's making sure that the work is getting done and it's on time, and that the people who are doing the work have the tools and the resources they need to get the job done. And if they don't, the project manager or the supervisor's job is to make sure that that happens, to make sure and to ensure the success of the project by making sure the resources are available to the people who are doing the work. Making sure keeping a lid down on the scope creep that I talked about and things like that. So executing the plan, usually we have a negative feedback loop, which is ensuring that the project is progressing periodically. So we make sure that we have regular meetings and checkups and stand-up meetings to make sure that things are progressing on plan. And if something does come up, the earlier we know about it and we can handle it, the better. We don't want issues to fester for a long period of time. So project managers, again, are very good at that. So security project managers can have certifications as well. GIAC is one that's offered by the SANS Institute. There's the IT Security Project Management offered by the EC Council. And then Certified Security Project Manager, part of the PMP, and so forth. Again, they're very specialized, but you could, usually I think what happens is a project manager will specialize in security projects, usually for the consulting firms and things like that. So some aspects of implementing process are technical and deal with the application of technologies, and other deal with the human interface to technical systems. So if we're going to implement a system, there are 4 basic approaches for implementation. There is the direct approach, which is, let's say we're implementing a new firewall. It's just a simple example. We need to, our old firewall is a little long in the tooth. It's no spring chicken anymore. And we have to replace it with something that's more modern, that's got features that we need, that's going to be better for the organization. We've gotten over the hump of convincing the organization to invest in new firewalls and technology. And now we're ready to start figuring out how we're going to implement it. And we have to make a decision how to do that. Well, the direct implementation would mean that we set up our new firewall, and one day, maybe in the middle of the night, we cut over to the new firewall. Some people call this the cold turkey method, right? It's how people used to try to quit smoking, right? You go cold turkey. You just decide one day you're going to stop, and you put them down. And as you know, one of the risks of going cold turkey, and anyone who is a smoker, I was never a smoker, but a lot of smokers can tell you that method simply does not work. You can't just go cold turkey. A lot of people pick the habit right back up. Same thing with our firewall implementation. If we try to go cold turkey, kind of rip the Band-Aid off and go to the new platform, if it doesn't work, we're going to be right back to the old system, and a lot of people are inconvenienced. But it's the easiest way to roll over to a new system, especially if we have to because the old server went offline or died or something like that. So another method is phased implementation. And this would be more like your cigarette smoker that's going to go on the patch to try to get off smoking. So they're going to take something that's going to slowly wean them off the old system of smoking to their new system of not smoking. So we can do the same thing in our IT projects where we phase in very slowly the new platform. Some technology, it's easy to do phased implementation, and some technologies, it's very difficult. For example, a firewall, that would probably be rather difficult to do a phased implementation. You have to roll over, I guess, just certain functionality one at a time. You might have to do that in, conjunction with other, with routers and things like that. So you may not be able to do a phased implementation for some things, but other things maybe you can. When the option is available, it's certainly one way to do it. And a pilot implementation is, let's say we had 30 offices and we decided, let's implement this new technology at Office 5 first, see how it goes, learn our lessons, and then come up with, how we're going to finish the implementation of the remaining offices. So you can kind of, let one group pilot it and work with you to work out the details and the kinks of the plan, and then you roll it out to everyone else from lessons learned. So that's another good strategy. And finally, there's the parallel strategy where you can run both systems in parallel for a period of time. In most IT projects, parallel implementation is a challenge because you end up with 2 different sets of systems. I'll give you an example with the firewall. Let's say we were going to do a parallel implementation to a new firewall. So we ran both firewalls together at the same time. And anytime there's a change on the old system, we have to remember to go in and make that same change in the new system. And likewise, if we make a change in the new system, we have to make sure it's also made in the old system. And over time, the longer you run in parallel, the more likely it is that those systems are going to drift apart from one another. So those are some of the risks with doing a parallel implementation. So again, we have direct, phased, pilot, parallel. There are advantages and disadvantages to each of these, and that's certainly up to you and the project manager to decide which one of these is the most appropriate, depending on what type of project it is. Another option is to outsource. So some organizations outsource almost all of their IT operations. Some only outsource some of them. But IT security, of course, is one of those areas that can be outsourced. I've seen some organizations that outsource only IT security for a variety of reasons. I've seen some organizations that outsource everything but IT security. So I've seen it both ways. When an organization outsources IT services, information security should be part of contract arrangement with the supplier, so it should be an important part of that arrangement. So like I said, outsourcing is rather common in business. A lot of organizations do it. It's just important to be aware of it. So governance and change control, we talked about this already. So we talked about governance and change control and how that drives the organization. So technology governance guides how frequently technical systems are updated and how updates are approved and funded. And we should manage that change process. So to do that, an organization can improve communication, enhance coordination between different departments, reduce unintended consequences, improve quality of service, all of this positive stuff we can do to ensure successful change. So there are non-technical aspects of implementation. So one of those is culture of change management. So we want to make sure we have a culture that is going to accept change and is going to embrace change. Otherwise, we're always going to have problems making changes. And of course, when you work in an organization, I think you kind of inherently get a feel for this. You kind of understand what the culture is. So prospect of change can cause employees to consciously or unconsciously resist that change. I'm sure we've all worked with somebody who every time there's a change, they act like it's the end of the world and the sky is falling. So the stress of change can increase the probability of mistakes or create vulnerabilities in the system. So anytime there's a change, it does create some extra vulnerabilities. As I'm recording this lecture, we recently experienced that with a change in the executive branch of the United States government. When we went from one administration to another, there was a lot of confusion. There was supposedly chaos, although one administration denies it, the other one says we did. But either way, there was some confusion and there was some opportunities for vulnerabilities there. So that was a great time for somebody like Russia to go in and start deploying ICBMs where they're not supposed to because we're not paying attention, for example. So change can certainly, it's good, but we have to do it right and make sure that we're not going to get distracted by the change. So one of the things your book talks about is the Lewin change model, which is where we unfreeze the current system, we move to our new, we make our changes, and then we refreeze back into position. And again, that's an organizational thing, but most organizations have some variation of that model for making changes. So some considerations for change. So steps should be taken to make employees more amenable to change by reducing resistance to change and developing a culture. So ways that we can reduce resistance to change, the more ingrained the existing methods and behaviors, the more difficult it is to make a change. It's best to improve interaction between affected members of the organization and project planners in early project phases, instead of letting somebody know, hey, next week we're making a completely new change to your system. Instead, we involve people from the very beginning so they feel like they're part of the change. The 3-step process for project managers: communicate, educate, and involve. And joint application development is another area. So far too often, especially in IT security, far too often we have this tendency to want to work alone in a closet. And not involve users for a variety of reasons. For better or for worse, it's the way a lot of us work in IT security. But joint application development says we should do the opposite. We should bring the end users and people in the organization into that process, and they should be a part of that design process. So that's certainly another strategy. So developing a culture that supports change. So resilience, an organization understands change is a necessary part of the culture, and embracing change is more productive than fighting it. And I will tell you that as far as a culture that supports change, one of the important things for a culture to support change is for that to be driven from the top down. So the executive suite should be initiating and encouraging and enforcing changes, as opposed to being one of the people moping around saying, I don't want change. Because if it's not driven from the top, if people feel like the executive suite doesn't want the change, then they're not going to feel like they need to be a part of that change either. So it's important to make sure that this comes from the top down. All right, so we have certification and accreditation. So basically, IT security. So when we make changes, as we do implementation, we can use accreditation, which basically authorizes us to do certain things based on meeting an accreditation standard. For example, payment card PCI compliance, DSS PCI compliance. You can get accreditations for that, which authorizes you to take credit cards, for example. So that would be an example of accreditation. Certification, on the other hand, is an evaluation of your controls and your IT systems and certifying that you comply with a standard. So it's not really giving you permission to do something. You're kind of, advertising the fact that you're certified to do something. But it doesn't necessarily mean that you can or can't do it. Accreditation is sort of the other way, where you cannot do business in certain sectors without being accredited. All right, so in the next slide deck, we're going to talk about maintenance, maintaining IT security systems.